Hello to those who are joining today. This is a green finance webinar brought to you by Ethex. And I'm just watching as we have some more joiners, and I'll get things going in just a minute. Okay, so welcome everybody. Delighted that you can join us for today's 1 hour session. It's on green finance options. It's going to be a practical session, an informal discussion where we talk about all the ways that individuals can start using their finance to tackle climate change, accelerate the sustainable development goals, and create positive social impact. I'm Becky O'Connor. I'm Head of Pensions and Savings at Interactive Investor and also co-founder of Good With Money, the ethical finance website. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Charlene Cranny, who is currently running a project called Economy of Good. She's also was Senior Director at UCSIF for 8 years and was the former director for Good Money Week. I've also got today Josh Gregory, who's founder and chief executive of Shugi, which is a green investment app, and Julian Parrott, who is partner at Ethical Futures, the financial planning firm. Not to mention, last but not least, Lisa Ashford, who's chief executive of Ethex, who are hosting today. So I will start off with some introductions, but I'm very keen that we get onto the practical stuff as soon as possible. We know that there will be lots of questions and there will be time for questions at the end, around 15 minutes. And we will be happy to take questions on the chat as well as we go along, because undoubtedly things will be raised for you. So where are we at the moment with green finance? This is a really exciting year. We are in COP26 land. We're 6 months away from the UN climate change negotiations. And so it feels very relevant more than ever to talk about what we can do with our personal finances to help save the planet. This is an existential threat. And all of the people here today are doing that one way or another with money. So Charlene, if I could start with you, would you be kind enough to introduce yourself to us in just a minute?
Yeah, so I used to work at the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association for about 8 years. So have over that time built up a really solid view of the industry and all the different ways that we can be good, more sustainable, more responsible with our money. I also directed Good Money Week for a few years as well. So really interested, something I'm really passionate about is speaking directly to consumers, just the man and the woman on the street, about how they can do good with their money as part of an ethical lifestyle. And so recently I just started up a project, Economy of Good, where I'm out there sort of interviewing people in the industry, again, to help educate consumers on this topic.
I recommend everybody check that out, some great interviews. Josh, would you like to tell us a bit about you and Shugi?
Sure, so I'm Josh Gregory, I'm founder of CEO and CEO of Shugi. We're an investment transparency platform. We're in beta, but we're about to launch on the App Store. And we help people understand the environmental impact of their investments and how they can take action to improve it. And we cover a huge number of shares, as well as ETFs, funds, investment trusts. And we automatically connect to all the biggest UK brokers and investment platforms. And we also allow people to input their portfolios manually. So we cover 2 main metrics: climate impact, carbon impact, as well as temperature alignment. And we do that for individual investments at a portfolio level. And we give people some context. So we tell people how good investments are in relation to various tailored benchmarks, which we generate automatically. And we use sort of a green and red cloud sort of visual way of helping people understand how good their portfolio is in those metrics. So yeah.
Sounds great. I can't wait to try it. Julian, tell us about you and Ethical Futures.
Yeah, so I'm Julian Parrott. I'm a partner of Ethical Ethical Futures. We're independent financial planners based up in Edinburgh. And we specialise in ethical investment. The name gives the clue away. And we work with clients from all walks of life, all stages of life, to help them achieve their personal financial aims, but to do that in a way that is aligned to their values and their aspirations. So I like to think that for the last 20 years or so, I've been helping people make their money change their world.
Fantastic, lots of experience. Lisa, if you would like to give us a minute on Ethex, for those that don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thank you for chairing today. So Ethex is a positive investment platform, which some of you might know. We use people-powered finance to help raise investment for a whole series of great social enterprises and communities that are helping to fight climate change, reduce poverty, and build more resilient communities. So that might be everything from sustainable transport to community-owned renewable energy, or ecological farming, for example. And we also have a sister platform called Energise Africa, which is raising investment for solar businesses that are expanding their pay-as-you-go solar to increase energy access in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thanks. I think it's interesting, and we'll come on to it, that you highlighted there ways you can invest in things that are not just renewable energy. There are more options out there than just renewable energy when we're looking at greener money, which is hopefully something we can expand on. Before we get going with a look at the products that are available and how you might access green finance in your day-to-day personal financial management, Julian, perhaps you'd be able to talk to us a little bit about the trends that we're seeing at the moment, and with the perspective of your years of experience, how things are different right now. How do they feel different? How do they look different in terms of the options available to people?
Thank you, Becky. I think the grey hair here gives me a bit of background experience. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of media around this and a lot of buzz, and it's great, and it's really important. But I think the interesting thing is that this isn't new. I've made a note here, 1984 and beyond. I mean, the first values-based, ethical, environmentally focused investment fund was launched in the UK in 1984, and there's a long track record beyond that. So this has been an evolving market, but it has gone on a whole new trajectory in the last probably 3 to 5 years, I think. And I think there's some interesting things around that. I mean, I think one is probably a sense of urgency. I think people are becoming, obviously a lot more climate aware, and reacting to that. I mean, I think it's information. I mean, we've got Josh here talking about his solution. We're now in the data age where information can be gathered and shared and manipulated, but and analysed and put out to make available. And then accessibility as well. I mean, we're here. We'll be talking about Ethex, and we'll be looking at a whole variety of different platforms and ways that people can actually align their money and put it into areas that they want to do. So you can personalize the approach. So I think that's that's some of the drivers there. I mean, there are particular themes. Would you like me just to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I see. Historically, we used to talk about ethical investment, and now we talk a much broader range of issues. As I say, I think the areas underneath that ethical banner were always a lot wider than they were perceived. It wasn't just about not investing in arms or tobacco, but we have seen a lot more thematic approaches to investment. We've seen the development of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which the finance industry has taken on as a framework that in some cases needs a bit of review, but in certain areas where, again, talking about things like Ethex, where there is investments which have absolute positive additionality, they create additional impact. the market, there's that opportunity. And again, I think it comes back to the access aspect, that there are a lot more opportunities, as we'll talk about, for people to make a change.
So we know that there's more demand out there, and it's growing demand, and it has been growing for the last couple of years. But perhaps the supply of products hasn't caught up with the demand quite yet, but is clearly doing so. Which brings us neatly on to the options available now. Charlene, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what people can do with some of the financial products that we all have, current accounts and pensions, and how those options have evolved and are evolving for people.
Yeah, so I'll quickly cover banks first. So there are some banks out there that people will have heard of that are founded on their ethics and their more ethical approach. So that includes like Co-op and Triodos. But for other high street banks, you can find out what their kind of ethical score is over at websites like Ethical Consumer. There's also just recently a report that was published called Banking on Climate Chaos, and that was about fossil fuel financing and which high street banks were providing most money to the fossil fuel industry. So you can go and have a look at that report and see how your high street bank fared there. And if you do decide that you don't like what your bank is up to when it comes to fossil fuels, and once you've had a look at the ethical consumer score, then you can switch, and you can take advantage of a 7-day switch guarantee, which is provided by the current account switch service. This is something I only actually learned recently about, and it's great. And it just means that, it's just really easy to do, and they take care of it for you. So there shouldn't be any problem switching to a bank that is more aligned with your values. On the pensions, I still think it's quite tricky to find those sustainable and fossil-free options. And also you really need to think about, your pensions properly before you switch. I know Good With Money have got like a whole guide on this and a report. Actually, it can be quite complicated, but I think things are getting better. There are a lot more pension providers that are committing to a net zero emissions future, for example. So we've got Nest, Aviva, Scottish Widows, Royal London. They've all made net zero commitments. So I think if your main concern is about the environment and climate, then that should be just the minimum that you should expect from your provider. But, ask for the information. Pension funds aren't used to being asked for the information, but the more that people ask, the more it will become available to everybody. Find out where your pension is invested. They should tell you that. Don't be fobbed off. And don't underestimate your power to actually to change things. For example, PensionBee, they had a sustainable pension option, but it was still invested in fossil fuels, and a lot of customers complained about that. So they went out and created a completely new product that they launched in December last year, completely fossil free. So ask for what you want, and hopefully, and there's examples to show that they will do it for you.
There's a little bit about looking for the negatives that you don't want in your financial products, but also looking at the claims that are being made, and do the actual underlying investments match the claims, which is getting harder, isn't it? So now that this is more of an area that people are aware of, there's this risk that the reality may not match the claim. How do people go about understanding that? Perhaps Josh, you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So it's greenwashing can be a slight problem with a lot of investment products, and our platform is primarily can be used for combating those sort of claims. So when you get information from a company, you get information from a financial provider, you can plug it into Sugi and see whether it matches what's being told. Of course, we look at environmental metrics only, so we can't judge providers. We can't let you assess providers on the sort of social and government side, but Well, you can definitely do it for pension funds, for example, as well as ISAs, SIPs, that kind of stuff.
And Julian, what are the products that people are tending to go to first for greening their money? Do they start with an ISA in reality? Do they start with a pension? What are people doing already?
Yeah, there's an element of horses to courses. It does depend on where they are and what stage of life they're at. I mean, just picking up on Charlene's point about pensions. I mean, I think one of the things now that we live in a world where a lot of people who are employed are in an auto-enrollment scheme is to beware of the default fund. These schemes are designed to put you in a personal pension and for you to have very little interaction with it. But in most cases, so there's a default fund which you just go into automatically. But in many cases, the Nest one is pretty good, but then there are more environmentally aware options even within those environments. So it's aware, you have to take a bit of responsibility in that. But I think, yes, I mean, most people's entree into investment will be through a savings account. So, the considerations about your bank and what they're doing with the money will be the point. And then you're looking at ISAs of many varieties, of which there are now, and which might be invested in stock markets or might be invested in capital with purpose, and pensions as well. Pensions will tend to be a more stock market related investment.
Talking about all the different types of investment available now in the green finance area, there tends to be a few more options than the traditional stocks and shares ISA and funds available, such as those opportunities that are typically listed on Ethex. Lisa, could you run through for us some of the other alternative investments rather than the traditional stocks and shares ISA?
Sure. So, I mean, just doing a quick whistle-stop tour, we've already talked about savings accounts, but that is a good starting point for people to think about ethical savings. And someone like Ethical Consumer is quite good at providing a tool that you can choose what's important to you and what's not, and it will rate the ethical savings accounts according to your inputs. So that's quite a nice tool to use. Someone was asking about Nationwide Building Society, and you could have a look at them to see what their policies are and whether that fits with your moral compass, shall we say. And then apart from that, yes, there are funds, and there's an increasing number of ethical funds which are coming to market. It's really important to look under the lid and at all the small print to find out exactly what that fund's policy is with regards to things like fossil fuels or other things, because as we've seen, there are some that are advertising as green when actually that might just mean that they have under 50% of their holdings in fossil fuels, for example. So it's really important to look at that. On Ethex, we only put what we consider the most ethical options, and those funds might be actually only investing in positive organizations who are having so within the heart of the organization, they are committed towards trying to make the world a better place, which is what we would call positive investing. So rather than just screening out the bad stuff, it's actually having a much more positive footing. And then in the market in general, you obviously have transferable shares for ethical organizations, which might be something that you have a particular viewpoint on, and you might be able to invest in those through a traditional investment platform. Or in fact, there's ethical bonds as well, which might be, there's starting to be more green bonds available to the retail market. And I think that trend will continue. Again, really important to understand exactly what that product's doing and where the money's being used, and obviously what all the risks are associated to that if you're a retail investor. And then there's community shares and bonds, which is something that Ethex specialises in as well, which are long-term patient investments into communities or organisations, co-ops, etc., which are doing something really positive and having a sort of democratic makeup to the organisation on a one member, one vote basis. So it doesn't matter what you invest, you still have a say in the organisation and how it's governed, which is quite interesting in the context of sort of shareholder action these days. So that's a very quick overview. Obviously, Good With Money, plug to Rebecca's site, has really good information breaking down, you know, what the different options are and making it really easy for the layman. So I definitely point people in the right direction there.
Charlene, thinking about how much money people have is relevant here, isn't it? So you've got different options, whether you've got £5 or £5,000, and you know, if you're at the lower end of the spare money scale, what could you be looking at, and how can you get involved?
Yeah, so I've been talking to a lot of platforms recently, as I think they're a really great place to start, sort of as a beginner, testing the waters, perhaps just investing a small amount to see what happens. And they are all so different. So, you know, there are some like Ethex that invest directly into companies they know exist to have a positive impact. Other platforms have got like an ethical fund where they exclude tobacco and arms or pornography, but anything else goes. And there are other platforms that, you know, have got sustainable options and unsustainable options, and then it's just up to you to kind of choose what you want and create your own portfolio. So it's really important that when you are looking at these platforms that you understand those differences. And just to plug Economy of Good again, I have interviewed quite a lot of them to find out what those differences are so that you can compare and contrast. So that information I'm starting to build up for you. But yeah, it is easy to start with small amounts, from whether you've got £5 or 50 quid, and yeah, but just make sure that you understand the platform you're investing in to make sure that it really does align with what you want.
Of course, it's absolutely brilliant that there's more competition in this space now, and that there's, you know, more platforms to choose from, but at the same time then it's more confusion, and it requires a little bit more guidance to know which is the right one for you. Josh, we talked briefly earlier about greening your finance being a lot more than renewable energy, and that's a useful thought to have, because I think people do just assume that it's all about solar and wind, and that, you know, they are your options if you want to reduce CO2. But what else is there? What's the full kind of spectrum of green in terms of the investable universe that we can access as individuals?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to say that, yeah, I think most people would say that having a fully diversified portfolio is quite important for your financial security. So if you're only investing in, say, green energy, that is quite a limited exposure, and obviously that particular sector will go up and down in terms of financial value. So you need to think about your objectives, and you can diversify your portfolio to include other sectors as long as you're quite clever about which companies you invest in within those sectors. So if you're looking at carbon impact, there are sectors which 100% have a much higher average impact, such as industrials or consumer discretionary and things like that. And then some which are much lower, like tech, for example, is the classic one. So tech companies don't have a big supply chain. They're not like a shoe company where they build stuff and then ship it around the world. But at the same time, you see with tech, they might have huge emissions coming out of their servers. They've got high electricity costs, and some of them are switching over to renewables, but not all of them. So it's not all kind of good stuff in the tech world. And you see that with Bitcoin, for example, the big debate about the electricity consumption associated with Bitcoin. Healthcare and financials, you can pretty much invest, and they generally tend to have a much lower impact overall. But then within healthcare and financials, if you look at, say, smaller companies or companies which are based in the emerging markets, they tend to have a higher impact in general because the companies aren't concentrated on carbon efficiency, or that the regulation is a little less strong there. So within it, I guess what I'm trying to say is within each sector, there's always going to be slightly higher and slightly lower companies. And what we do as Sugi is try and help you identify which ones are which, so you can optimize your portfolio, but stay diversified, I guess, overall, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings us on to another area within this, which is the difference between active and passively managed funds. And when we think about green finance, it involves more active management of the underlying investments, and that usually comes with a higher percentage fee. There are options within the passive investment space, which is typically lower percentage charges. But Julian, perhaps this is something you could talk a little bit about, actually, the passive versus active investing. Does all sustainable and green investing fundamentally need to be active, or are we seeing some decent offerings that are passive and cheaper? You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry. I think the market has evolved, and there are now much greater opportunities to have a more sort of focused, particularly environmentally focused passive solutions. So just to kind of cover off that jargon, I mean, active is where an investment manager is making a specific decision about what they buy and sell and how they construct their investment portfolio. And passive used to be really what we sort of thought of as a tracker fund that just took a standard index of the measure of a kind of an economy, so the FTSE 100 or the FTSE 350, and just bought all the shares, and its performance was whatever that index did on a day-to-day basis. The attraction of active was that you had great flexibility. You didn't have to buy the oil companies in the FTSE 100. You could take decisions to mitigate the movements in that sector. But over time, we've seen bespoke indexes being created so that you can look at healthcare companies or envirotech companies or renewable energy businesses or whatever, and create portfolios or indices which measure them. I think for the purist, and I'm probably slightly on the purist side, that the active gives you the ability to control, and it allows you a bit more nuance in terms of looking at the activities of any particular business, so you can take a more balanced view. Whereas an index to function needs a degree of scale. Therefore, it has kind of wider parameters, kind of lower threshold, arguably, in terms of where it invests, but it does make for a much cheaper and simpler investment, and that's why it's very prevalent in low-cost solutions such as the auto-enrollment world, but also the online sort of robo-advisor that we refer to them, where you can make your digital transaction and invest on an online basis. So tools, likes of Sugi are becoming increasingly critical there, to have a look at it, especially if it's an independent tool. So from our point of view, we always try and meet the managers and kick the wheels and understand exactly what the investment managers are doing, and take a view on how they put the whole package together.
Thanks. And Lisa, I suspect you've got something as a purist to say about active versus passive, and how people can understand that a little better.
Well, I'm all about taking control of your money, and I do think that with the market changing and technology allowing us to look at a lot more options and see what is available, and perhaps go beyond what has historically been quite an opaque area just for specialists. I think it's really important to for everybody actually to just get a handle on what their money's doing and actually form a position on what they want it to be doing. Now, that's not to say that I don't think Julian has a really important place in the market to help advise and support people. But I think now that things are changing so much that it gives us so much more opportunity to actually manage our own money better and fully understand the entire sort of transaction life cycle when it comes to using our money. And I feel that we have a moral obligation to be more proactive in how we manage our funds, our cash, our investments, our savings. So whilst I don't think everyone should rush out and invest all of their money in things that they don't fully understand, that's not what I'm saying. What I do think is that actually we need to be much more active as individuals in the management of our money and, take the control back a bit.
Of course, we're all different, aren't we? So some of us may want to do more for ourselves and others may not want to do quite so much and take on the full responsibility ourselves. And it's really down to personal preference, confidence levels, and that kind of thing.
That is true. Can I just interject one thing, because there's a couple of questions coming up saying, well, I went to my advisor and they gave me something which, I didn't feel went far enough. And I think, hopefully with webinars like this and more conversations, people will have the confidence to go back and say, no, that's not good enough. Actually, I want more than that. And I think that, holding advisors' toes to the fire a little bit more is quite important, because, I think there is so much more that they can do and should be doing. And hopefully we'll see a real evolution of the market so that, people like Julian are not the minority.
Absolutely. Go on, Julian.
Yeah, just a little bit, because just to echo that. Right at the beginning, you referred to us as a financial planning firm, and I think that's one of the key things. It's actually understanding that you can plan your finances and you can take a view. So it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. A lot of financial advisors, for good reasons, work within a regulated world, and therefore they would tend to recommend regulated products, which tend to be stocks and shares market, funds. But people. A good advisor will take the time to understand what you're trying to do, and I think more and more people are becoming aware of where you can get advice, and certainly from our point of view, and I'm an Ethex investor, so from my point of view, it's about understanding how you apportion the money that you've got to achieve certain aims. And the great thing about things that are on Ethex are that you can access them at pretty low levels of investment as well. So it's not a one size fits all, but it isn't. Your money doesn't just have to go into one particular pot either.
Yeah, and one of the challenges is you're asking people for their ethics, and not everybody understands their own ethics or has a very nuanced view of what they think about certain issues. And so really, people, personally speaking, want something that does a bit of everything often. But there may still be compromises and sacrifices that have to be made within that necessarily. And talking of compromise and sacrifice and mutual exclusivity brings us on to the risk return issue here. And, there is a myth that, and it is a myth, I think we can say that as a myth, a bit like climate change not being man-made. It's a myth that you have to forego returns necessarily to invest in line with green values. But maybe there is still this lingering doubt. Maybe there's still a doubt that this is a trend, and the reason the returns have been good is that it's a trend and it's not fundamental. What sort of evidence, actually, Josh, I may come to you first, is there to comfort us that this is not just high returns because it's a trend, but it's something that we can expect to grow long term, and not have to take on more risk than we feel comfortable with either?
I think, yeah, it's a really interesting debate, and I think it's coming down in the favour of people who see there being no trade-off recently, because the evidence is just coming in. Obviously, there is this kind of idea that perhaps because some of the lower emission companies, for example, like the tech companies, have done really well over the past year, and they've been associated with higher environmental, sort of high ESG ratings, there'd be some association between the two. So people think it's more of a sort of sectoral bubble rather than a sort of an impact bubble. But I think there is a lot of academic data as well showing that companies which take these things seriously, which orient themselves to a climate change, a world where climate change is present or is happening, do tend to take a long-term perspective on all sorts of aspects of their strategy, which means that they are run better, and especially with the S and the G as well, so the social and the governance side, 100%, if a company has better social and governance scores, then it will be run better, and it will be, considering all the relevant stakeholders within its business, and that will be associated with higher returns generally in the long term or the medium term. I mean, there's academic literature which now supports that, which I think is really helpful for the sector, because it gives people that assurance that they're not necessarily going to sacrifice returns by investing in something with high impact.
And Julian, is this something that people are still worried about? And does it affect them when push comes to shove, they push the button on the green investment and then go, actually, I'm not sure because of risk and return?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is to a degree, but relatively not that significant. I mean, we tend to find that our clients are concerned first and foremost to make a difference, and they may express the view that they're willing to take a hit, and this is something that we will try and disabuse them of in terms of the aspects. I mean, the academics, report by Fried, Bush, and Bass in 2015, an empirical study of 200 research papers going back over 20 years showed that there was a good business case for investments that took an environmental, social, and governance perspective. So, there's fairly good data in terms of that. What we have always said to people is that you're doing something differently, and therefore your investment will probably be slightly out of kilter, especially if it's in the stock market, with the mainstream fund. So if oil prices are falling or rising, then your portfolio might do something differently. But I think the other case is, the other sort of good business cases that what we're tending to see, particularly with the environmental sector, is that you're investing in kind of businesses of the future. Businesses which are going forward and doing something for the future, and their value is growing. It's not historical businesses, particularly extractives and oil, which are really kind of largely 20th century businesses. So their time has passed. So I think I've invested that way for most of my life, and I haven't my pension fund tells me I'm very happy to be environmentally, socially invested. So and that's definitely been the case, actually, statistically. If you look over the last 5 years, that has been the case, and it was actually quite marked through the last 12 months as well.
So thinking about the types of impact and that level of choice that we now have, and kind of working out what our own values are, what kinds of impact can you tick with one box? So there's what I want a bit of everything. How possible is that, and what are the areas? What are the boxes that I can tick with one single investment? Josh.
I think that's quite difficult to do. I think that you're right. There are a large number of impact metrics out there now, and we all want to optimize. We all want to optimize for the highest amount in all of them. More transparency is always going to be better. There's a lot of, I think there is a lot of information that's locked up at the institutional level, or it's just available for kind of professional investors using kind of these very professional platforms. But to get it to retail investors is really important to have, transition to a climate positive world apart from anything. So ideally, Sugi is wholeheartedly in favour of transparency on every metric for every investment. I think with carbon, I mean, there are big gaps in the data. So companies, they don't want to report certain metrics, or it's hard for them to get the relevant information, which is totally understandable, or even to agree on standardized formats. And the example I use is like biodiversity impact. It's very difficult to compare in a kind of quantitative way between companies what their impact is on biodiversity. I used to work for a think tank called Global Canopy, and they're working on a deforestation metric, and that's going to be really important as well, because it's something that people are interested in. But again, it's very difficult to standardize. And even with carbon, it's really difficult to get from companies. You can get like scope 1 and 2, which is essentially like direct emissions, but the indirect emissions, so associated with the company supply chain, are really difficult to assess. And then if you're looking at like water usage and waste footprint, again, companies just don't report on that stuff in a standardized way. So the data providers essentially have to do some economic modeling to understand what the company will be doing. So we're definitely not in a world where we can pick investments with a kind of sort of dashboard of all the key metrics, environmental, social, and governance ones in a quantified way. I think with social, especially because it's not necessarily so quantifiable, they're more values based as well as governance. But I think we specialize in the retail investment world, so the shares, the kind of mainstream investments like funds, investment trusts, and ETFs. I think when you're doing more project-based investments like with Ethex and Energise Africa, you can really kind of drill down on some of these interesting social metrics and really kind of be sure that you're doing a lot of impact at the project level. So I'm sure they can speak more to that than I can.
Yeah, of course, and it's an evolving thing, isn't it? This, so the more we demand transparency, the more transparency that there will be, and there is also a gap between large and small companies sometimes in what they have to, the information they have to disclose. Their ability to measure their impact as well, based on the size of the organisation, is something to bear in mind. We can't compare apples with apples in that respect. Charlene, what the gap between what we can measure and what we want to see is perhaps where greenwash can come in. What are platforms doing, not just platforms, but the whole investment industry? What is happening to kind of close that gap so that we can't get away with greenwash anymore?
Yeah, I mean, it's still a bit of a wild west out there. Terms like ESG, sustainability, responsible investing, they don't have any kind of strict definitions or standards. So, two funds that are called ESG, for example, could have, be of very different quality. So you do have to right now still do a bit of digging around. And so some of my suggestions on where to start with that would be to kind of think about the impacts that you care about, so you can get really specific on the ones that you want to focus on. So it could be climate, gender and race equality, oceans. If you aren't sure just yet exactly what impacts you really care about, look at the Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals, and kind of they will give you an idea of where to start. And then once you've got the impacts you really care about, then have a look at what you're invested in to see how those companies match up to those values or to those issues. It does get complicated because some of these platform portfolios are made up of lots of different funds, which all have lots of different companies within them. So, you could end up having a 0.1% investment in around 8,000 companies or something like that. So platforms are trying to work out how to provide this information in a kind of easy, accessible way, so it doesn't just look like a big old massive spreadsheet. But do ask for the information. They are working on providing that information. They know that people care about it. So it is happening, certainly with quite a few that I've spoken to. And then the other thing you can do is just ask the platform about, the kind of impact that they care about, just as a provider, never mind the sort of the options that they provide you. What do they care about in terms of their impact, and how do they manage that or measure that? So you can really get an idea of who you're doing business with. And I would just keep in mind, those definitions, and remember that you know, ESG doesn't translate into impact necessarily. ESG tells us who's kind of less bad, but impact tells us who's more good. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at all these different terms and thinking about your impact.
That's a nice way of describing it. Less bad and more good. I like that. Lisa, have you got any quick top tips for people on getting started?
Start small, and do your homework, and go to information sites, you know, to get more information, and to read more about what options are available. You know, I think by dipping your toe in the water, even if it's switching your current account, or, you know, if that seems like too much to do, then, you know, you can find options where you can invest for as little as £5 or £50 in an ethical way now. So, you know, you can really try something at a small level, and get comfortable with it. And I think actually we probably learn best by doing in a number of ways. So as long as you're happy that the money that you invest, you know, you might lose that money, it's capital at risk, and that you have enough cash to be able to do that, then, you know, just start very small. And obviously you need to really think about what matters to you the most, I think, as well, and find your own opinion really about what are the things that really matter to you, and what you may or may not want to support directly, or something a bit more generic where it automatically diversifies the risk for you, but also the impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard to avoid looking inside yourself for some of this as well. So top tips from you, Julian.
Purpose, capacity and values. We've already spoken about values to quite a bit, but what am I investing for? When do I need that money back? And what goes wrong? What happens if something goes wrong? Is this money I can afford to lose, or money I can afford to be locked up for a long time? Is there money I need to have access to? Those considerations will then drive you down particular routes in terms of whether it's money in the bank, whether it's money in stocks and shares, whether it's money on something very specific and focused and allocated. And as I say, they needn't be mutually exclusive. You can touch all those points at relatively low cost. You just need to make a decision about your own personal financial planning to allocate the money, and then do it in line with your values.
Absolutely, not forgetting that this is all about financial goals too, of course, and what you want out of life yourself. Josh, any quick top tips from you before we move on to questions?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I sort of what everyone else has said. So don't take what companies say at face value. So try and do a bit of research. Try and distinguish between the greenwash and the real stuff that people are saying. And decide, it's really important to decide your priorities between environmental, social and governance. And perhaps that's a good way of starting off to kind of narrow down the universe. And of course, download Sugi, use our app, connect your portfolio, and you'll get a bit of context on and some information about your carbon impact, as well as the global warming alignment, the temperature of your investments. So that should help you from an environmental perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so I can see that the chat has been incredibly active while we've been talking. And forgive me if we don't get through all of the questions that have come up or comments that have been raised in the 10 minutes that we have left. I'm just going to pick out a few. And also, please, panelists, if there are any that I've missed out that you want to answer, then do say. Question, does the panel have a view on the balance between disinvestment and remaining invested, as that gives a position to invest? So this is a big debate in the industry, unresolved. What are your thoughts? Charlene, let's start with you.
Oh, sorry, I missed that question there, Becky. Sorry.
So it's on whether or not to remain invested for engagement purposes in organisations like yours companies, or to disinvest entirely.
Yeah, sorry. So that's one that I was actually answering in the chat, so that's why I was distracted.
Aha, well done.
Yeah, I mean, I think different people have, what I've written is, I think people have different views on that. I think some people will say that they just don't want to be invested in that industry, and that's actually okay. But, you know, to have an impact and to create change, we do need to work with companies to try and change their behaviour. So actually staying invested and having those conversations can be really important, but only when it's working. So there does come a time when you might need to divest because those conversations aren't getting you anywhere. So that's my position. Stay invested, try and create change. If it's not working, then get out.
Does anybody else on the panel have any burning views on disinvestment versus engagement? Anyone want to come down on one side or the other?
I think it's quite hard as a retail investor to, when you've got such a small share in a particular company, to think that your voice will be particularly meaningful, especially if you don't have a vote at, you know, say AGMs, for example, because, you know, your broker holds the proxy. So I think it's much more meaningful if you can sort of talk to your broker or talk to your pension fund provider and sort of start to aggregate a voice so that actually becomes meaningful in that divestment sort of engagement debate. At the moment, I think it can be very difficult for retail. But that's just what I've been saying.
Lisa?
Just to say, you know, organisations like Share Action are very good on that front, and, you know, encourage people to have a look at their website as well, because they're really good at supporting shareholder action and holding companies to account. And obviously, you know, if you invest in cooperatives and community benefit societies through withdrawable shares, you do have a vote, and you do get to go to annual general meetings, and you can become a director of the organisation. So, you know, that is a very democratic model, not for everyone, but worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a totally new way of voting that we perhaps underused. We've had a question on email, which is a practical question on how to trickle a regular £35 a month into an ethical investment for grandparents for their grandchildren. Julian, is there an easy answer to this one?
You could do it through a regular savings account. That's one option, but you'll have investment returns related to that. If your grandchildren are quite young, then a long-term investment would be appropriate, and that could be something like a collective kind of multi-asset investment fund. Would be probably the most likely sort of tool that we would use for that, and you can probably do that through some of the platforms online as well.
Okay, we also have a question, which is it's a fairly niche question, but it may apply to others. It's to do with investing when you have a dual nationality, UK, US, dual national based in the UK. There are some restrictions, aren't there, about how you can invest and double taxation risks. Does anybody want to tackle questions on how to invest without breaching these tax rules? Lisa, any guidance?
Well, only to say, we mentioned this before the webinar started, because my partner is in exactly the same position. He's US, but he has status in the UK as well. He is constantly trying to figure out the best ways of doing this. So this is just a personal opinion, not a professional one. He has invested a bunch of times through Ethex into organisations that are happy to accept that investment. But as far as I'm aware, there is a tax treaty between UK and US, and there is also some netting arrangement. So you shouldn't really be paying double tax. You should be paying as I believe it, the higher of the two taxes. But this is obviously quite a complex area, and I'd say having a financial advisor for that probably is recommended.
Absolutely. Julian, as the advisor on the panel.
Regrettably, some companies will have a little tick box that says, are you a US citizen? In which case, if you tick that box, you won't be able to invest. because they have additional reporting responsibilities and they don't want to take it on. Lisa's right. Essentially, investing in pensions will be okay. Investing in cash deposits will be okay. Investing in collective funds, unit trust, OICs, what US people would refer to as mutual funds, may not be okay, and probably not through an ISA either, because US authorities won't recognize the tax-free status. But investing directly into directly held securities, such as a company that might be offered through Ethex, should actually be okay. But yes, take the tax advice. There's thresholds at which the reporting requirements apply, and you need to be aware of that.
I had absolutely no idea it was so complicated. I'm just going to take one question that's for me, which is about interactive investor. Allows investments in non-ethical businesses. What are we doing to encourage these companies to change? So there's a huge shareholder voting program at Interactive Investor at the moment. It's a campaign that we think is really important, and it's to the previous point on if you are invested in companies, you have a vote, and it's really important to use it for things like climate resolutions. But also on Interactive Investor, there is something called the ACE 40 range, which is a range of 40 funds and trusts. ACE stands for Avoids, Considers and Embraces. There's also an ethical long list and an ethical model portfolio. So it's a platform that offers the widest possible choice of investments, but obviously, trying to help people who are interested in investing ethically too. One last question, which is on impact specifically, and I empathize with this view that after listening to this, you may like the idea of impact more than anything else, because that is the doing more good bit of Charlene's equation. How can we focus on impact companies and funds? Is there anywhere that's really good to go just for those? Charlene?
Yeah, so I mean, the places that I would suggest are, of course, Ethex. We've got Abundance. We've got another platform, Ticker. So they do exist. Those are 3 places to get started. But yeah, I would actually recommend as well looking at Good with Money and looking at more of the options available in some of those good guides.
Any final thoughts from any of the panelists? Anything that we've not covered that you really want to just say? You've got the last word, 2 minutes.
Just on impact, I think it's become very much the the trend phrase of the time. I think there's kind of 2 impacts. There's an organisation called GIN, which is Global Impact Investors Network, and that's very much a big businesses trying to do something more positive in terms of how they operate and behave. It won't be a real sort of, and then there's what I would call additional or additionality impact, which is the sort of thing which UN Global Compact or global SDGs were ideally designed to set up, which is bringing something new to the table, new money, new investment that really makes an impact and a focused impact. I think both are relevant. FX is an excellent example of how you get real on the ground impact through investments. There's a whole load of other impact funds, but you have to pick and choose and look at them and see exactly what they do, because the name isn't the answer to everything.
There's still no getting away from that do your own research point at the moment, although maybe over time with innovations like Sugi, that we will be able to think a little bit less deeply about this and have some confidence that our money is doing good. Thank you everyone. Thank you for everybody who's attended the session, all of the great panelists, and for Ethex for putting this together. I hope you found it useful. The recording will be available and a follow-up email too. And I will let everybody get on with their Friday lunch. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.